Washington State University. Go Cougs!
Hello and welcome back to the course on collecting smartphone sensor data using iOS. In this third module, we will be learning how to communicate the sensor data or to transfer it from the phone to a web server. In part one of this third module, we'll be giving an overview of communication over the web. There's basically four main pieces that we need in order to accomplish this task. First, we need a protocol for communication, and the standard protocol is the HTTP, and we'll look at that. Then the type of request. There are two main types of requests you make over the web, and they're called GET and POST requests, so we'll look at those. Then we need a format for the actual data that we send, and a common format that's used for communicating over the web is called JSON. And then finally, of course, we need a web server that we can communicate the data to, which will mainly involve putting PHP scripts on the web server, and then we will send the data to those scripts. The scripts will store the data and then return a response as to whether they were successful or not. So let's look at each of these pieces. First, the protocol that we'll use, you are no doubt familiar with, and that is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP. And this is the main protocol that's used over the web. Now, there are two main types, and the difference is whether or not the communication is encrypted or secure. A normal HTTP request is sent as plain text, and therefore anyone who intercepts that communication would clearly see what data is being sent. Whereas the HTTPS, or secure request, the initial URL request is sent in the open, but then after the connection is established, the data that's sent is encrypted, so that someone who is monitoring the network would not easily be able to decipher what is being sent. And obviously this is important for our sensor app, because the information we're sending is sensor data and is most likely private, and we don't want others to look at it. Now, we're going to, of course, be using iOS for the communication, and iOS by default requires that you use the secure transfer protocol. And of course, if we were doing this for real, we would want to do that. But for the sake of this course, I wanted to use an insecure server, an HTTP request, in the event that you don't have access to a secure server. So I'll be using just normal HTTP requests. But that, of course, requires me to configure the app so that it will allow the non-secure requests. So here again, we'll be going into the information property list, and we'll be setting a specific property called the App Transport Security Settings. And there are several sub-properties under there, but the one we are interested in is called Allow Arbitrary Loads, which by default is set to no, but we'll set it to yes. And by doing that, that will allow our app to communicate to any website, whether it's HTTP or HTTPS. So let's jump over to Xcode and make this change to our app just to get things started. So I will go into Xcode, load our sensor app, and we're already in the information property list. Remember, we added our properties to allow access to our various sensors. But for now, we're going to add this new property, and it is called the App Transport Security Settings. And again, this doesn't really have a value itself, but it has sub-properties. So what I'm going to do here is open up this sub-properties. Of course, there are none yet, but I will add one. And you can can see I have 3 choices here. The one I'm interested in is this allow arbitrary loads. And again, as you see, the default is set to no, but I can set that to yes. And so now my app can contact any website, whether it's secure or not. So that's the only changes we'll make at the app at this point. Of course, we'll have quite a few more once we actually do the communication. But let's go back into the notes and talk a little more about communication. So within the HTTP protocol, there are 2 main types of requests that are made. That's the GET request and the POST request. GET requests are usually used to retrieve data from a server, and POST requests are usually used to send and store data on the server. Now, the GET request, you may have seen this before, usually has not only the URL that you want to contact. Here we're contacting a PHP script called GET, but it also sends the data in the URL itself. So you see a question mark indicating that these key value or name value pairs are about to come, and then we see the first name is the first key value, first, has a value of John, the second key value, last, has a value of Doe. Now, a POST request can be used to affect the same transfer of data, but it's more of a 2-step process. So first, the particular URL up and to just before the data is contacted. So if we wanted to contact a PHP script called POST, which is in the web apps directory on example.com, then the POST request would first make a connection, and then if the connection is established, only then will it send the data. So this is nice for 2 reasons. One is the data itself is not in the URL, so that isn't sent in the open. And if the request we make is an HTTPS request, this data is actually encrypted before it's sent. So that is a nice feature of the POST request, especially for sending sensor data. Another difference is that since the GET request, the data is in the URL itself, you're limited to ASCII text for the type of data. Whereas in the POST request, this data is unrestricted. It could be arbitrary data. So for these reasons, we will be using the POST request to transfer our data to the web server. The next piece is the actual data itself. So what is the format of the data we're going to send? Obviously, we want to send the sensor data. And to do that, we're going to use a very simple text-based format called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Obviously, it began with JavaScript, but has become somewhat of a standard for data communication. And JSON is very simple. It consists of 2 things, either objects or arrays. An object is an unordered list of these name value pairs, and they're delineated by curly braces. So each name value pair is the name, followed by a colon, followed by the value, and the name value pairs are separated by a comma. The other main type of structure in JSON is the array, and the array is delineated by square brackets, and again it's a comma separated list of values, but in this case the order is preserved. So depending on what you're sending, in our case we're going to be sending one of these objects, which will have things like the latitude as the key or the name, and the actual latitude value as the value. But if we were sending, say, a list of sensor value or a list of sensor data that we've collected over time, we may want to send it as an ordered array. So JSON is the format we'll be using. So we'll be converting our sensor data into JSON format, and that's the data we'll be sending in our post request. And the last piece is the web server itself. Now, I'll be using a web server that I have access to, but most likely you will be using one of your own. And there's two main types of setups of web servers. The most common is the LAMP server, and that's an acronym for Linux, which is the operating system, Apache, which is the web server, MySQL, which is the database, and then PHP, which is the main scripting language that's used to affect the communication. But of course, if you're on a Windows-based server, then you'd be using the WAMP protocol. In either case, you'll need to find the directory where the website will access its main documents directory. In most Linux implementations, that directory is in the var www html directory. And on my web server, I further made a subdirectory called web apps, and that's where I'm going to store the PHP script that will accept the data from our sensor app. So with these tools in place, we will need to make a few changes to our sensor app to affect this communication. So if you remember, in the sensor app, when the user taps the send button, then what we want to happen is first we want to grab the most recent set of sensor data, the motion and location data. We're going to convert that to JSON format, and we're going to add a timestamp to it. And then we're going to send that JSON data over the web to a PHP script that will accept the JSON, pick it apart, and store it on the web server. And then it will return a response as to whether it was successful or not, and then we'll inform the user using our little message label here of whether the data was sent or whether an error occurred. So we'll be doing that throughout this module, but in the next part 2, we'll specifically look at how to package the sensor data into a string which is in JSON format.